I want you to imagine that it is, 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday in February. The sky outside is the color of wet concrete. And if you live in Michigan, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Just a sort of heavy, pressing gray that tells you the sun has given up months ago. You're sitting at the kitchen table, you're looking at a laptop, you're looking at maybe this month's bills, and you realize that the whole room has gone quiet. The house is silent. Now, I'm not talking about the kind of peace and quiet that people write poems and songs and all kinds of pretty things about. This is the kind of dead silence. You don't hear the refrigerator compressor. You look outside the window and you realize that the neighbor's front porch light isn't on, and you realize that you are out of power. You try to flip the light switch on, nothing happens, right? Usually when that happens, you think, well, maybe somebody hit a light pole down the road, down on the corner, that place where all the wrecks happen. But this time it's different. You look out, the neighbor's lights are off, the street lights are out, and you realize that you have actually treated the light switch on the wall by the door as if it's kind of like a magic wand. As long as you did all the right stuff, as long as you went to work and paid the bill, everything worked the way it was supposed to work, because the universe around you was somehow obligated to send electrons into your house. And now things are not working the way they are supposed to be working. This is exactly what Francis Schaeffer called the line of despair. The moment when that light switch doesn't work. It's not just a technical failure. It's a realization that the world that you have ordered your life around no longer works the way that it was supposed to work. The way, and this is important, the way that you thought it worked. Things don't function the way you thought they did. Suddenly, everything grinds to a halt. This is the reality of what happens when a whole civilization sort of grinds to a halt, when things don't work the way they're supposed to, because our assumptions have been rooted in this idea, this insane idea that little switch beside the door when we walk in the house is some kind of a magic wand, that as long as we do what we're supposed to do, everything will work out just the way it's supposed to work. And what we find, if we're honest and if we're willing to dig in and wrestle, is that the light switch is not a magic wand. That things don't always simply just work the way they're supposed to work. No, suddenly we kind of hear the funeral music playing and things aren't progressing the way they're supposed to. And when that happens, we have to ask ourselves, was our assumption of the world wrong? That's what we will be addressing today, and I hope you are ready, and I'm glad you joined me. Thanks for being here. It's so easy to get lost in the noise, to be consumed by the outrage, the anger, and the constant hum of fear. But if you look past the chaos, you find a landscape of raw mechanics and hard truths, the things that don't change, even when everything else is on fire. I'm Jared Lee. I don't focus on the friction of the moment. I'm looking at the wider ground that makes the struggle inevitable. This is the whole field of battle. Thanks again for being here. Listen, I am Jared Lee. If you haven't tuned in until now, you can catch me on my Substack It's jaredmlee.substack.com. You can find me, just search the whole field of battle. What you're listening to right now in any of your favorite podcast players. You can, you can find me all over the place. Just look for Jared M. Lee and you'll find me. I want to hear from you. I want to know how you're receiving these things. Also, if you're listening right now, you could actually be watching. Not that I think I'm that great to look at, but I know some people like to watch rather than listen. I'm on YouTube at Jared M. Lee Official. So thanks for joining. And yeah, hi, I'm waving right now. See, if you're only listening, you can't see me wave. So there we go. I mean, I'm just looking at the computer screen. But, it's a way to connect. And my desire is actually to connect around some of these things that we're talking about. Because I find it to be really important that we process and think through, really importantly, together, the things that are going on in our world. I like to lift up and take a big, wide view. That's why I called this the whole field of battle. I kind of find that we get into these tiny little fights in different corners, and we're not zooming out. And if we could see the big picture, we might actually realize that we're fighting over something stupid that there's plenty of over here. But we don't take the time to do that. And it's really my heart that we would be able to kind of see the wide lens and learn how to get along again, because we live in this world where no one wants us to get along, and we fight over nonsense and stupid things, and when we do that, no one wins. And so I want us to win. I want all of us to win. And I don't think that that's unrealistic. I think we can all win if we can learn to listen to one another. So that's the story, right? Like, we actually might be in a world where the light switch isn't magic. And I want to explain that. Again, if you've not tuned in, I want to kind of go back through. This season, we've been investigating and interrogating the Strauss-Howe generational theory. We've been looking at the fourth turning theory. That's what is kind of generally referred to. And the way that works in the 4 seasons of a cycle of generational existence on this planet, I've gotten a lot of questions around, is this around a nation? Is it around civilization? And I keep saying, I think Strauss and Howe would argue this is around a civilization. The West has been the typical sort of, place where they've investigated and seen this sort of play out from Europe and America. And now that's gradually kind of growing with globalization. Certainly, people ask, are there, third world tribes that have less contact with the outside world where this stuff isn't shaping them? Of course it is. Of course. But I'll bet if an anthropologist were to go in, and Strauss and Howe would certainly argue this, that if an anthropologist were to go in and look at a isolated tribe over the course of 4 generations, they would kind of find a typical repeated cycle along these lines that they're talking about. And what we've seen, I think, in the sort of global history is a syncing up of these as we become more integrated as humans. So let's just review. You got the high. You've got this moment where these people come along. Again, the most recent we keep looking at is from 1945, 46 era, where we begin to build and things looked good, and we treat this sort of the engineers of culture, the machinists, the people who know how the gears work. We treat them as if almost like they're priests. They just build, and we love it. We build these electric substations to give us power, and electricity comes into our homes. In a previous episode, we talked about the fact that until 1945, no one took a hot shower, and suddenly we have these people who are engineering this great thing happening in civilization where within a decade, suddenly the entire world has hot showers, or at least Americans in our most recent case, right? And we're excited, and look, it can't possibly get any better. And this whole thing, that's the future. This life that we're building together becomes the future. And as we talked about Francis Schaeffer, right? This is the upper story. This is the life that we are building together that becomes everything. Electricity working when you flip the switch, without you and I having to know how a substation works and how power plants are going to get electricity into our houses. And we don't know. I don't know that. Maybe you do. Dear listener, I'm not trying to slight you. Maybe you could make electricity out of thin air and have it come into my house. And if you can, I am incredibly grateful for you, because I can't do that. I just know that if I pay my bill, I have electricity, and I'm very grateful for it. But I can't fix that, right? But that's what a high does. We treat those people who can make these things work like priests, and they are going to make all of our lives better. And we're grateful. And we begin to take them for granted, don't we? We begin to think, oh, well, when I flip the switch, the power's going to come on. And so we neglect this reality that this is far beyond us, but we've accepted it. And so then according to Strauss-Howe, you have this awakening period, this time where, we sort of begin to think this is just life. And we start thinking this isn't enough. This electricity, this plumbing, this hot water, this nice hot shower that I'm taking, it's not enough. There's got to be some deeper meaning. And we begin to look for what Schaeffer called the lower story. I think maybe sometimes I get them confused. I'm not going to lie to you. Sometimes I forget what he called the upper and the lower story. But there's an upper story of just basic existence, things we take for granted, and there's a lower story that provides meaning. And what happens in this awakening period is that we begin to wonder, is there a deeper meaning? And of course, we look for it. In our most recent time, we'd call that sort of the hippie movement, the 60s, the time when people were asking these sort of spiritual questions. Certainly, there's more meaning to life. And of course, what happens, at least most recently, what happened is we found out we didn't have the answers. We didn't know. Was that good enough? Was that enough? Did that find fulfillment? And I would say no. I think, as much as I love to listen to the music of that era, I love Bob Dylan, and I love Creedence Clearwater Revival, and, the Forrest Gump war movies, and the Platoon, and all of those, like the great music, but it's obviously music that's searching and didn't find the answer. That's what we come to find out, right? We just couldn't discover the thing that we needed to find. It's almost like we took all this infrastructure that we had built out of the 40s and 50s, post-war Reconstruction, all of that stuff, and we build electricity, and we build these plumbing networks. I mean, every city in America now has pipes under the streets so that we can be comfortable, and that becomes the platform on which we build. And that infrastructure is almost like a trust fund that can't possibly run out while we go digging through the streets, poking holes, looking for a deeper meaning, and we become empty in the process. And in that, we begin to, Strauss and Howe would say, we begin to unravel. That's what happens through the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s. We begin to face sort of an unraveling period when things, it's just discontentment that drives much of sort of modern life. And then we land in what we are in now, where I would say it's further than discontentment. It's almost, I think the big word is ennui, the the idea that there is no meaning. Nihilism is beginning to take a deeper hold. Nihilism is the idea that nothing matters, that nothing is important at all. And we become empty, and that's where we are. That's where we find ourselves, at least according to Strauss-Howe. I keep getting this question framed in the way of, are you saying that Strauss-Howe essentially have everything figured out and that they're exactly right? And I'm actually not saying that. I don't think Strauss-Howe or anyone else or me or anyone has everything figured out, but I think they have put their finger on an interesting theory. I think, this is episode 7. I plan to record one more episode in this season, and then we will leave Strauss-Howe for good, or at least partially. I can't say for good. I don't like to say never. My mama taught me never say never. But we will kind of disengage from this Strauss-Howe theory to take other ways of sort of zooming out and taking a larger picture eventually. But I wanted to kind of spend some time thinking through the way Strauss and Howe framed this, because I think it's so important. And I, like I said, I do think they have their finger on something. I'm not saying that they're 100% correct, but I think there's something that they're circling around that is worth us hearing, and I think it begins to explain much of the world that we find ourselves in. And I think when you sort of layer these things together, Strauss-Howe alongside Francis Schaeffer, alongside others that we will bring in at future points. I mean, we've referenced other things in this season. Jonathan Haidt, The Anxious Generation, has a different explanation for Gen Z than Strauss-Howe does, but there's a certain kind of overlap that happens when we live in a season, and I don't think anyone can argue that we live in a season right now, a period in history that feels hopeless, just hopeless. Previous generations, and we've addressed this, have placed their hope in this idea that our government leaders can be trusted. I think a couple episodes back I said the number of people who believed that the U.S. government could be trusted to do what was right in the 50s, it was like in the 70% range, and now it's in the 17% range. This has to mean something, right? We don't depend on our institutions, and we've addressed all of that. But in light of that, you've got people growing up, my own children, growing up in a world where our institutions can't be trusted, where literally every day we are confronted with this reality. I don't even know whether I can say fact, but we are. That's another problem, by the way, of living in this era. What is a fact? I have heard this phrase, alternative facts. I wrestle just with that phrase. How can you have one fact and another fact that is an alternative to that fact? What is truth? And that whole question gets to the core of, I think, what our hearts are wrestling with. What is true anymore? And it to me, it doesn't matter what your ideology is. I think we all want to have an answer to this question. What is truth? Pilate asked Jesus that question. What is truth? And it is something that for all of human history we've longed to know, and here we're in a place where we actually use a phrase like alternative fact, as if there's something that can be explained other than that. Anyway, all of that to say, we live in a world where the reality, whether you want to call it a fact or a truth or not, this is just a simple reality. Every single day, we are confronted with leaders, Congress, business, president, cabinet, who are wicked people. Or I shouldn't say are wicked, because there's alternative facts, whose names turn up, in correspondence with a well-known human trafficker. We've talked about that. And it all just hits us in a way where we have a hard time making sense of it. Imagine growing up in that. Like I remember a world that was not that. I remember a world where you count on your neighbor. I remember a world where when you moved to a new neighborhood, 3 neighbors brought an apple pie or cookies or some such thing over to your house when you first moved in. I remember that world. Some of you do too. I remember a world where I knew I could leave my tip on the table and leave and go to the bathroom and leave the restaurant. And I know, if there's someone at the next table, I'm always taking that tip. We no longer live in that world. We've talked about these things in this season, and this is the reality. Again, let me come back to this. Imagine you don't remember that world. Just imagine for a moment you have no memory whatsoever of a world where you could depend on your neighbors, of a world where you just knew if you moved to a neighborhood, people would come in and welcome you, of a world where, well, I better sit here until the waitress comes over and gets her tip because otherwise someone's going to take it. Imagine having no memory of that world. That's Gen Z. No memory of that world because our world has been in such a great state of decline for the past 10, 15 years, and it has. And if you're older than 25 or 30, you probably can agree with me there. And if you're younger than 25 or 30, then hear me. The world hasn't always been this way. This isn't the way it's always been. And Strauss-Howe make the case that that's a normal sort of turning of events that tends to happen in human history. And I think, to me, and maybe I'm the crazy one, but to me, that brings me some comfort. It brings me comfort to think that what we are currently living in is not the norm for humanity. Because you could believe it was. You could believe, especially if you're under 20, 25 years old, you could easily believe this is just what people are. It's not, and it's not always. And Strauss-Howe predict a world that I actually do, this part of their theory, I really do believe in, because I don't think anything really kind of lasts forever. They predict a world where we actually get over ourselves and we begin to build something new and beautiful and good together. And I believe in that, and I'm hopeful for that. And I'm leaning into that and believing that that's going to happen. So as we think through this, as we think through the power coming into our houses, we think of the magic wand of the light switch. There's 2 sort of categories that I like to put people in, and I'm going to use weird words, okay, because it's onomatopoeia or alliteration. That's not onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia is the words like drip and bang, things that sound like they are. That's not what this is. This is alliteration, using 2 letters that sound alike. Mystic, mystic, and machinist. Let's use the M's. The mystic, and in this case, I'm talking not about the spiritual people, the mysticism. I'm just not what I mean. I mean the bureaucrats and the administrators and the people who just simply believe that the light switch is magic, right? They just believe that if you turn the switch, it works. And the machinist is the person who actually connects the wires. They're the people that climb the telephone poles, the people that power the substations and the nuclear reactors and the windmills or whatever else. I don't even know. Wherever the electricity comes from, the machinists are the people that make sure the electricity comes out of the air. I know it's more complicated than that, but they're the ones that get the electricity in a bottle, and they're the ones that deliver it to your house. And the mystics are the people in the boardrooms and the administration and the middle management people that just think it's magic, that it's going to happen. And that's the world that we find ourselves in a typical Strauss-Howe fourth turning, where we have this battle between the mystics and the machinists. it's going to happen every time. We're going to find our way into it again, because it turns out that the light switch is not a magic wand. It turns out that somebody's got to make it work. We talked about this in an earlier episode, right? We talked about the ideology of the Soviet era, and in the 40s, how the Soviets wanted to, Stalin, we can just say Stalin. I don't mind putting it. I think sometimes I hesitate to put any tragedy on one human being. Let me just bear with me for a minute while I go down a rabbit trail. I did a big research project in grad school on the Holocaust, the murder of 6 to 8 million people at the hands of the Nazi government. And one of the big things that comes out, right? Like, we all blame Hitler, and we still do. Hitler gets a lot of blame, and I'm not trying to defend Hitler. Stop, please stay with me. I'm not saying Hitler was a good guy, but Hitler didn't do that alone, right? That was not just Hitler. Was he a part of it? Absolutely. Was he innocent? Heck no, he wasn't innocent. He was guilty as a dog. But he didn't do it alone. And in fact, the idea was not Hitler's idea. Oh, did he support it? 100%. Am I defending Hitler? No, I am not defending Hitler. Don't tell your friends that Jared's defending Hitler. Gosh, no, not happening. I'm not defending Hitler. I'm saying he gets more credit than he deserves for what happened. He certainly played a role, a big role. But there were other players whose names many of us have forgotten. And I don't know that that's all that great. That's why I don't like to blame sort of one person or one group for the absolute destruction of humanity, when I think humanity is to blame for the destruction of humanity. I think it matters. So all of that to say, that's why I'm like, well, it wasn't just Stalin. It was Stalin, but it wasn't just Stalin who did this. And again, we talked about this in a recent episode, where this that we've been talking about, Stalin was a mystic, and his friends were mystics, and they just believed that if we believe the light switch works, then the light switch will work. And that's the exact mistake that was made, right? Do you see that? Like, they thought, well, it's about what we believe, and then it works, and it didn't. It didn't work because the whole system was collapsing. The tractors were rusting, and the pipes were degrading, and the things in that era of the Soviet history, they were not working any longer, and they happened to be in a Strauss-and-Howe fourth turning when all of these things were beginning to fall apart. And so who suffered? The machinists did. The people who actually knew how things work began to suffer. And this is what we call the purge of reality. We can't acknowledge the truth, because when we acknowledge the truth, everything begins to fall apart. Do you see that? When we acknowledge the truth, everything begins to fall apart. And so rather than acknowledge the truth being the tractors are rusty and the system, the infrastructure is collapsing and we need to invest in infrastructure. If we say that, then we become the problem. The mystics, the people in charge, the people running the programs become the failure. And so rather than blame them, they'll point the blame at the mechanics. Well, obviously, you just don't believe well enough. We're in the same situation today. We're literally in the same situation. Think about it. For every lineman, every person out there climbing a telephone pole or an electric pole or whatever we call those poles that we see all over the place with wires running from one place to another, if you know how they work, good on you. I don't know how all of those things work together. I know electricity runs down them, and I know because of them, my little light switch works when I flip it. But for every one of those people out climbing poles and flipping switches in some kind of substation, we have 10 people making PowerPoints and advertising, efficiency models, or, filling out TPS reports or whatever kind of nonsense. I don't know. Whatever. We call this managerial bloat. We talked about institutional decay. We talked about an organization that gets top heavy. That's what it is. When you have 10 paper pushers for every guy that's plugging things in, that's a problem. That's the world that we live in. That's the world that we live in right now. That's where it is. It doesn't work. That's not sustainable. And yet, that's what we found ourselves in. All of our economy is built not on manual labor anymore. It's built on service industry. And we've exported much of our manual labor to primarily, I'd say, China. Much of Asia, they used to be called the Asian tigers, smaller Asian countries, Singapore, Taiwan, etc. That their economy has exploded over the past 30, 40 years because we have outsourced our labor to them. They're selling their labor to us. There's not a whole lot of that going on in America anymore. We talked about the collapse of the U.S. dollar. We talked about the American economy. Those things are all linked to how this is fleshing itself out. And here we find ourselves in this place in history when our economy, relative to the world economy, is actually drowning. When you really look at the numbers, we're in a difficult situation. Why? Well, I think it's because we've placed a lot of faith in that upper story, right? Believing that the lights would just come on without focusing on how to keep the electricity running. This is a part of it. We've focused on that story, which involves things we've talked about, justice and equity. These things are important without asking the question, why? Why is it important? These are some of the reasons that I think we're struggling. These are some of the reasons that I do sometimes question if we'll make it through as a civilization, as the sort of America of the West and of history. Will we survive this next turning? I think we can, if we can recover that sort of lower story, the story of meaning, the story of purpose, the story that answers the question, why does it matter? Why does comfort matter? Why does justice matter? Why are these things important? I think if we can answer those questions, we can begin to sort of put our finger on how we will begin to move into the next era with a healthy and vibrant economy, civilization, society, and yes, even government. I think we can do that. So what do we need to do? What do we need to do as citizens of the Western world? As many of you, I know, probably all of you, are Americans listening and thinking, what is it we need to do? I think we have to think through two things. We've addressed this before, and I keep coming back to it because I do think it is essential. We have to think through the lower story. We have to be able to answer that question, why? Why are these things important to us? Justice can't be important to us so that we feel good about ourselves. And that I don't think that's enough. And I don't even think it can be important to us because it's quote unquote right. Define right. What makes something right? What does that even mean? Define right and wrong. I don't even know that we live in a world. Like I said, we have these alternate facts. Well, my fact might be person X needs to be executed for spitting gum on the sidewalk, right? That's a fact. And your fact might be What's the phrase from the Constitution? Cruel and unusual punishment. And who gets to determine, right? I mean, I'm not making a case for shooting people who spit gum out. I'm really not. But I am saying without some sort of understanding of why it matters and why rights and justice are important, we could easily go that way, couldn't we, as a civilization? I mean, if my right to walk down the sidewalk without stepping in gum becomes paramount, becomes the most important thing in the world, well, then we start executing people who spit gum on the sidewalk. Again, I think that's absolutely ridiculous. You're going to go tell all your friends that Jared thinks we should shoot people that spit their gum on the sidewalk. Please, please, please hear what I'm saying and understand what I'm not saying. Use just a modicum of energy here for 1 minute to consider, without a standard to define right from wrong, who gets to choose? Who gets to choose if it's the people whose pet peeve is stepping in gum on the sidewalk? Right? If that's what's the standard? We haven't identified a clear and strong and viable lower story. And so when we cross that, we enter into the line of despair, not my words, that's Schaeffer's, where we don't know how to process the world apart from that. And we live in this post-truth era. With a post-truth era, all we need is a whole bunch of lawmakers who don't like to stand in gum before we start shooting people who spit out gum. I know how ridiculous this all sounds, but I hope you get my point. We have no standard. So we need to answer that question. Why does this matter? Why is justice important? I have some answers. I have some thoughts on it, but I'm just going to leave it out there because I maybe we'll come back to this in episode 8. Push me on it. We'll come back to this question. Why does it matter? Why does justice matter? Why is it unjust to shoot people that spit gum on sidewalks, for instance? Why is it? Who gets to determine these questions? I think it's valuable that we ask ourselves these questions. In fact, I think the failure to ask ourselves these questions is a part of what gets people shot all the time. Protests, even active shooters, I would argue. I think when people die needlessly, it's because as a society, we have failed to ask ourselves these questions like, why? And I think if we can begin to lean into why are these things important, we might actually see less violence happening. It's more of a hope than a certainty. But I think because we are focused on the upper story without paying attention to the lower story, I think that breeds a lot of struggles that we end up with in our society that I think could be avoided if as a civilization, as a society, we were willing to lean into why is this important rather than simply declaring something is important without a foundational view. That's one thing I think we can do. The other thing I think we need to be doing is identifying who the machinists are, asking ourselves, okay, why do we need 10 bureaucrats for every lineman? And let's take that up. Let's take that all the way up to the federal government. I mean, we've got these people, we've joked about it before, how the Onion poked fun at the fact that, they found the Capitol and it was like, oh, look, this is a place where laws used to be made, right? This reality. But it's funny because it's true. Because not a whole lot of laws are made at the Capitol anymore. In fact, I'm not sure what Congress is even doing anymore because, pretty much once a year they close down because they can't come to an agreement. Sometimes twice a year. They just close the doors and go home because they can't do their job. We've got 100 senators. I don't know how many congressmen. I don't know. I'm not going to try, but varies by state. I know we got 100 senators, though. It's 2 per state. But we got all these people sitting in a room who can't do their job. Meanwhile, we got people back home going, what do you want me to do? This is the exact issue. Too many bureaucrats, too many administrators, not enough linemen, too many cooks in the kitchen, they used to say. That's what we need to focus on that. And so here's the thing I'd ask you to do. People who are listening, people who are paying attention, people who care about making it together as a community over the next 10 to 12 years, 5, 6, 7, I don't know. Strauss-Howe predict 7. They say by 2032 we'll be entering into a new high. I don't know for sure. We'll see. But for you, if you're listening and you care about these things, here's what I'd ask you to do. Focus on the machinists. Invest in the machinists. In fact, if you are 20, 22, 23, 24, if you're in that stage of your life and you're going, what should I do with my life? I would encourage you to think through doing something where you understand how to plug things in. Don't worry about, management and that kind of thing. Worry about keeping the lights on, because those things are going to become very important in the next, I do think in the next 10 years. It's going to be the people who can actually sort of get grease under their fingernails, right? To keep things going. It's going to be those people, not the people. Think about it. This is fascinating. Think about this. And you know this is true. If you see, a boardroom full of executives asking for, some kind of, sustainability project, green energy, whatever, which I'm not opposed to green energy. If you can make it work, great. That's fantastic. I got no issues there. But let's say you got a group of 10 people and they're working on making windmills replace coal plants, whatever. I don't care. And you got this one guy, and this is true, and you know it's true. You got this one guy in the room, and of course he's probably got his name on his shirt right here, and his hands are calloused and stained, probably from work. And you got these executives, and they're like, yeah, make this happen. And he says, that's not going to work. And here's what's going to happen. You know that this is true. He's going to get run out. We talked about cancel culture. We talked about the fact that if you don't get on board with where we want to go, then you're the problem. That's exactly what happened under Stalin's Russia. Think about it for a minute, right? The guy who knew how things worked ideologically didn't agree with the direction, and they killed him in Russia. Now we'll just fire him and say he's uncooperative or he's an HR problem. Or again, I think there's probably green energy solutions that can help us move into the future. Please don't hear what I'm not saying. In this divided world, I can't have a single conversation without somebody being like, I can't believe you said. But it is true that one guy in the room who actually knows where the plugs fit and how things actually work together, and he says, oh, that won't work, and he's going to be ostracized, isn't he? And isn't that exactly what happened in Stalin's regime? And aren't we doing exactly the same thing again? So no. My encouragement to you is to identify those people who know how things actually work. Become those people who actually know how things work, and market yourself as the people who actually know how things work. And as we do that, and I think as a society as we do that, we as a society will actually work better, because we'll elevate the people who know how things work and not elevate the people who just have no idea and want to put on a good show. So do that. Let's focus on finding those people who know things work. And let's be those people who know how things work. And let's love those people who know how things work. And let's lean into this. So this is my encouragement to us as we think about how to keep the lights on. I know it sounds crazy. And I know when I sit here and I say these things, I know that, I know it's a bit on the edge. And I know there's probably people listening and they're like, seriously, you think the lights are going to go off? I don't think that, but it wouldn't be the first time something like that has happened in history. I think we have to be ready for it. I do. I genuinely do think we have to think about these things. And I think the more we think about those things, the better off we're going to be to move into the future and keep our society, our civilization active and thriving and healthy as we move forward. And I want to do that together. And I've said this and I've stressed this, and I won't stress it in this episode because we're going to lean back into it in episode 8. But we got to do it together. So I hope you are doing well. I would encourage you, please. I get a lot of messages. I get a lot of texts and emails and stuff from folks that I know you're listening. And I really want to say I appreciate your input. And it helps me think through the things and the nuances and the ways to sort of communicate some of these things. And really importantly, it's helping me. I'm already beginning to think about what's next. I've planned one more episode in this season. And then what comes next? And your thoughts, your input helps me to do that. So I would really encourage you to please reach out to me wherever you follow me, YouTube, Substack, other places. I am really looking forward to hearing from you. I get great input from a lot of you, and I'm very grateful for it. This is just a little side thing I'm doing. I'm having a lot of fun. I'm enjoying it right now, and you help me to enjoy it. And if I stop hearing from you, I'll get bored and then I'll quit forever. But these are interesting things. I think it's interesting topics. I think it's worth evaluating together, and I think there's a whole lot more that we can talk about. I've already started reading a stack of books thinking about season 2. And I would value your insight and your questions as we go. So we'll see where this goes together. And for now, I'm going to see you next week, episode 8, and we'll talk about where we go from here together. So have a great day. Thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate every one of you.